In this video, we'll be delving into the neural basis of emotion and learning how the brain generates emotional experiences that feel highly personal to us, such as rage, inspiration, and euphoria. Before we begin though, we need to look at the classical theory of emotion, which prevailed up until the late 1990s. It essentially depicts emotions as being firmly hardwired into human physiology and therefore elicited in a very predictable way in response to specific external stimuli. For example, always feeling fear upon seeing guard dogs, or always feeling instances of regret after having difficult conversations with loved ones. In line with this, we'd expect emotions to be fairly universal, with individuals across different cultures and social circles experiencing a similar range of emotions. An idea that stemmed from this classical view of emotions was that each emotion may be mappable to a specific set of brain regions that's responsible for evoking it, i.e., each emotion might have a neural fingerprint. Motivated to elucidate some of these fingerprints, neuroscientists engaged in a lot of fMRI studies. These involved artificially inducing emotions in subjects and measuring brain activity to look for correlation. Interestingly, conclusions did arise from this work, such as the idea that the amygdala are crucial for the experience of anxiety and for detecting fear in others. However, when these findings were considered more critically, it actually became apparent that no single emotion possesses a fixed fingerprint, and that any given one can be generated by various combinations of different brain regions. This is an example of degeneracy, a property that imbues all biological systems. For example, the isolated stimulation of the insular or the inferior temporal lobe, as well as the amygdala, can generate fear. This evidence effectively dispels the classical theory of emotion. Instead of being hardwired into specific fixed brain regions, emotions are actively and flexibly constructed by the brain. Neatly encapsulating these ideas, the American neuroscientist Lisa Feldman Barrett proposed the theory of constructed emotion in 2017, depicting the brain as an active generator of your emotions rather than simply waiting to receive external stimuli and unleashing them from hardwired circuits. Before we look at how the brain works in this flexible manner, we should probably consider which brain regions are involved. First and foremost, we're interested in what we refer to as the limbic system, which is a term that encompasses cortical regions, including the cingulate gyrus and the hippocampal formation, although the latter is more involved in memory than in emotion. Subcortical regions including the amygdala and the nucleus accumbens, which is involved in the encoding of reward, and diencephalic regions including the posterior hypothalamus, which is primarily involved in the regulation of basic parameters like body temperature and blood pressure. The idea is that every emotion you experience involves a different combination of these primary brain regions interacting. While attention has traditionally been directed towards this limbic system, it's now known that the cortex is also very important in adding context to your emotions and enabling them to be coherent. At this point, you may be wondering what the relevance of emotion generation is to modern science. In contrast to more concrete experiences like pain, emotions feel highly personal. However, irrespective of how sentimental and abstract they may feel, emotions are highly adaptive biological outputs generated by the brain, and they all act to promote your survival in one way or another. Inferring the different biological roles that emotions play is fairly intuitive when we're talking about more primal ones. For example, the positive feelings that a mother feels towards her offspring, or the panic that might inundate you upon stumbling into a dangerous situation. We can fairly easily appreciate that such emotions are necessary not only to keep us alive, but also to promote our successful gene transmission and the survival of our offspring. However, what may come as a surprise is the fact that every single emotion that you're capable of experiencing is performing this biological role. This is because emotions all either influence you to act in a specific way or to refrain from acting. For example, imagine someone who's recently started an online business and feels a real sense of bliss whenever they make a sale. While they may describe this positive feeling as something very personal and sentimental, it's actually serving a clear biological purpose, increasing their motivation to work and to secure more resources. Now we're ready to look at the theory of constructed emotion. The primary role of the brain as an organ isn't to keep you as happy as possible, it's to ensure that you're constantly meeting your energy requirements before you fall into a negative energy balance. This process is called allostasis, and it can result in physiological changes, but also psychological changes, because as we've seen, emotions are a very effective way of influencing your behaviour. Of course, in order to ascertain your energy requirements and inspire you to act in a certain way, the brain must be constantly receiving information about your physiological status. Indeed, ascending information from all areas of your body reaches the brain, and this is a process called interoception. Allostasis and interoception therefore go hand in hand as concepts. Interoception is brought into your consciousness as affect. Affect is much more basic than emotion, but it forms the substance of all emotional experiences. It describes basic underlying moods that you wouldn't typically label, and comprises 3 dimensions: valence, how good does this mood feel; arousal, am I energized or subdued; and intensity, how strongly am I feeling the way that I'm feeling. In order to convert this incoming interoceptive information from the body into affect, your brain has to constantly be generating predictions in the form of simulations about the interoceptive input it's expecting to receive. The limbic cortices and the insula are responsible for constantly issuing these downward predictions, which are contrasted with real incoming interoceptive input. If there are any discrepancies between the two information flows, error signals arise, which result in the predictions being amended to better fit the situation at hand. This is how bodily input to the brain is translated into affect. The primary motor cortex and the primary somatosensory cortex are also involved in the conversion of bodily input into affect. This coalescence of top-down cortical predictions with incoming interoceptive input to produce affect is at the absolute crux of emotion generation. Now, finally, how do we go from basic affective states, which are essentially fuzzy underlying moods that we can't precisely label, to clear, sophisticated emotions like joy, frustration, and resentment? It turns out that learned concepts bridge the gap between affect and emotion. If you have learnt to associate a particular affective state with a concept and named it, which is called situated conceptualization, you're able to experience a clear, identifiable emotion instead of just primitive affect. However, if you haven't assimilated a word or phrase that describes the particular physiological state you're in, you'll be limited to feeling rudimentary affect. In this sense, emotions are essentially complex, emergent forms of affect. A good example of this is the word Schadenfreude, adopted from the German language. Schadenfreude describes finding joy in someone else's misfortune. Someone aware of the word Schadenfreude who witnesses someone they dislike having a tough time automatically label the affective state that they experience as Schadenfreude. They won't feel its rudimentary components or be aware that it has anything to do with their physiological state. However, someone completely unaware of the notion of Schadenfreude in the same position will be limited to feeling a relatively generic positive affective state, aware that they're glad that the person that they dislike has been reprimanded, but unsure why, and also incapable of feeling a clear, coherent emotion that rushes over them. In order to feel emergent emotions, we as humans require named concepts. Since concepts are inextricably enmeshed with the emotion generation process, it's important that we quickly look at where they're stored. The medial prefrontal cortex is part of the default mode network. This brain network is highly important in the formation of autobiographical memories and your sense of self. The medial prefrontal cortex is believed to encode rudimentary representations of concepts in the form of memories. It seems that overlapping neurons in this brain area encode representations of concepts that have features in common. For example, concepts related to animals that swim, involving jellyfish, sharks, and a lot of other animals, may all be encoded by overlapping neuronal populations. The idea is that the medial prefrontal cortex encodes these abstract representations of concepts, but that the generation of full-fledged concepts requires the recruitment of all of the aforementioned brain regions that we've looked at, including the limbic system and certain additional cortical areas. And that's the theory of constructed emotion, which depicts emotions as highly adaptive phenomena that the brain actively and flexibly constructs. This theory also effectively showcases the true role of the brain as an organ, ceaselessly working away to generate predictions regarding your energy requirements and general physiological status, while simultaneously responding to incoming information from the body. The implications of this theory are also highly interesting. Since our emotions are closely intertwined with the concepts that we've been exposed to, great potential lies in the ability of exposing ourselves to new ones and to learning words simultaneously to actually modulate our emotional ranges. The emotional gamut that you access on a day-to-day basis is neither hardwired into your physiology, as the classical theory of emotion posited, nor is it set in stone.